Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba solidarity podcast from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott, and I am here today with Robert Crooks. This is an important week. It's the 80th anniversary of the victory over Hitler fascism, over Nazism, and May 9th is Victory Day. It is an occasion that was first celebrated in the Soviet republics, and it commemorates the victory of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany 80 years ago in May of 1945. So this is a very important day for anti-fascists the world over, but it's also a moment of profound exchange between Cuba and Russia. I believe that Miguel Diaz-Canel just arrived in Moscow to embark upon an agenda celebrating Victory Day. It will culminate in the traditional parade in Red Square. And there have been a lot of interesting exchanges this week on the topic of global anti-fascism.
Yeah, absolutely. The Communist Party of Cuba was also represented maybe last week, where they gave an address. Do you remember the guy's name and where he was addressing?
It was Emilio Lozada Garcia. So he's the head of the International Relations Department of the Communist Party of Cuba.
Right, and he he praised the sacrifices made by the people of the Soviet Union in their heroic fight against Hitler and the German war machine. Along with, talking about the rise of fascism across the world, he also spoke about the blockade against Cuba as fascistic measures, which I think was really interesting and really poignant, because we see the effects that this is having on people in Cuba. The government of Cuba has not been shy about calling this genocidal policy what it is, a genocidal policy. I think there's a lot of reasons that imperialist countries like the United States design these types of policies, but one of them is also to create an opposition, and specifically an opposition on the far right, which will be loyal to the fight of anti-communism, which has been a strategy of the United States and the NATO countries since NATO's inception. And I think it's really important that the Communist Party of Cuba is drawing that connection on the eve of this celebration of the defeat of fascism.
Absolutely, and I think that this sort of expanded theory of fascism with an eye to the Americas in particular is very important, and I think it's of profound significance, and that the left should attempt to grasp this in its specificity, right? Because fascism, as an extra-legal, exceptional state form, what have you, is often portrayed as because of its hyper-nationalism, an isolationist policy, or a policy that really bears upon a single country. Warring, yes, but for the benefit of a nation. However, fascism is a transnational project.
Yeah.
And this is very, very clear from the examples that were brought up by Lozada Garcia at this opening session of the Second International Anti-Fascist Forum in Moscow. He's describing not just the Holocaust, the Third Reich, etc., by way of precedent. He's talking about Batista's Cuba as a paradigm of fascism, Pinochet's Chile. These were American projects, but on foreign soil. His contemporary examples that resonate these past fascisms are the myriad coups against Venezuelan governments, against Chavez and Maduro and so on, coups in Paraguay and Brazil and Honduras. These are all U.S. projects. And I think that this description he offers is something that should really be understood as we watch Marco Rubio's shenanigans and as we attempt to classify the Trump government. It's this debate on the left: to what degree is Trumpism, is the MAGA coalition fascist or proto-fascist? I think that these are important characteristics that often elude your standard academic taxonomies.
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, last week in Havana, they were also holding the anti-imperialism against the resurgence of fascism solidarity meeting, where just like the Communist Party in Cuba was calling for international solidarity against fascism, they were doing the same at this conference in Havana. And one of the speakers at this conference, Fernando Gonzalez, who of course is the head of ECAP and one of the Cuban Five, he was drawing these, he was defining what Trump is as basically a neo-fascist movement, and he was tying it into neoliberal policies. Which is also, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind, how closely linked are neoliberalism and fascism, because they are both basically an attack on the workers, right? And it's sort of the need for fascism arises from carrying out neoliberal policies that try to crush working class power. Fernando also calls out, the Zionist regime in the same breath, and he's talking about what's happening in Puerto Rico and across Latin America and the Caribbean, and the need in this time for solidarity, international solidarity. And I think another key aspect to both of these speeches that were given by Cuban officials is that they talk about revisionism and the historical revisionism that's going on right now. And I think it's important to note that while this celebration is going on in Russia, there are a lot of countries, quote unquote Western countries, European countries, Canada, the United States, who are boycotting the celebrations in Russia, holding their own celebrations where Russia's not invited. And they're trying to sort of change the narrative of the defeat of Nazism into something that was actually accomplished by, the United States and countries like this. And I think that, this fight for truth, like historical truth, is also so important right now. I remember seeing a poll a while ago about over the years, I think it was like based on people in the UK, and it was like asking them over the years who defeated Nazism or who defeated the Nazis. And it's like quite clearly, like right after World War II, it's like, well, the Soviet Union did. But more and more over time, it becomes, no, the United States did. And this narrative is, of course, reinforced by US media hegemony and these types of things. So it's interesting to see that the Communist Party of Cuba and Fernando and others are calling out this revisionism, which I think is really important at this moment as well.
Absolutely, because it's not just a ceremonial task where various governments that stake a claim to this history convene parades and colloquia and so on. It really is a question of strategy, and really correctly ascertaining the balance of forces. And I think about this a lot, how trivial a question is it? The question of, for example, Trump's fascism. Well, it has a very particular significance where the possibility of a popular front is concerned, and where all kinds of historical anti-fascisms that we can draw upon are concerned. So I think that the Cuban government and its spokespeople, I think that their approach to this as a live concern is really of the utmost urgency. Here in Canada as well, we should really not be complacent.
No, absolutely not. And I think calling out these policies of the Trump administration, because of course, the policies of the U.S. towards Cuba have been abhorrent and inhumane and illegal for over 6 decades. But, Trump's maximum pressure campaign is, probably the worst that Cuba has had to deal with thus far in its history, in its revolutionary history. Basically trying to starve out Cubans, right? Trying to absolutely destroy Cuban society. Mm-hmm. And, we even see now that there's a, after the lie of there being Chinese spy bases in Cuba being debunked, I think it was last year, now there's a quote-unquote new report saying that they've this time it's for real. This time they've really found these spy bases. And with all the things that are going on with Cuba and all these attacks against Cuba from the United States, it's worrying to think about what these new so-called reports will be used as the basis for a justification for further amplifications of the blockade. And it's, I think we have to be really on top of this and really aware of what's going on here.
Absolutely. I mean, there's an absolutely disgraceful report. I believe it's Ryan Berg speaking before the House, and it's very, very, very fretful about the PRC's burgeoning role in Cuba, and it's certain that Cuba is a foothold for Chinese intelligence and so on. So this narrative of Chinese espionage, there's not an iota of proof. It's notably also exploiting Cuba's very difficult position. The only proof that I could find in this testimony, the smoking gun, where the alleged Chinese foothold in Cuba is concerned, is financial support during power outages and, a strategic arrangement that is buttressing the failure of the Soviet-era electrical grid, which we'd previously spoken about. The only evidence that they turn up is a beneficial trade relationship as specifically concerns energy. So it's very devious to spin that into a narrative of espionage or intelligence collaboration.
Yeah, this whole, Cuba trying to work around the blockade by expanding its trade partners. And of course, China, as the second biggest economy in the world, is going to be important for that. And China has, companies that are based in China have been helping Cuba, like you said, with energy and like solar power farms and stuff like this. And we also saw recently that there was a deal in tourism made between China and Cuba, where you can now get direct flights between China and Cuba, and neither Cubans nor Chinese people need visas to travel. So there has been quite an uptick in Chinese tourism into Cuba. I think the last numbers I saw was like from 8,000 to 26,000, so almost 3 times or more than 3 times more tourism coming from China. So this is also, I think, a really good thing for Cuba, but it's hard to see how the U.S. is going to react. Well, maybe it's not so hard to see. Maybe we know how U.S. will react. But, China and Cuba also have this very historic relationship, because there are, people of Chinese descent who live in Cuba, who have been in Cuba since, for 200 years. It only makes sense for them to be strengthening that relationship.
Yeah.
But that maybe brings us to the next thing we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. The tourist question being so important to Cuban development, 6.5 decades into an unremitting, brutal, we were just speaking of the characterization of the blockade as a warring means. It's warfare, though it transpires economically. Tourism is so important to Cuba. So, this is a good sign, this alignment. We read about the commencement of direct flights from China to Cuba last year. We have to reconcile this with these offensively selective stories that we see in the CBC and other bourgeois media platforms in Canada and the United States about the precipitous decline of tourist traffic through Cuba and the meaning of this. There was a hideous article on the CBC just several days ago about Canadian tourism to Cuba plummeting 30% or something like this. There's not a word in this article about the blockade. If it makes any citation of material hardships, it doesn't attribute that difficulty to the United States and its warring means. It doesn't attribute it at all. It's regime change propaganda, and it's scarcely credible reportage on a pressing human rights crisis.
Absolutely. And I think it's rather conspicuous that this came out the day after May Day, where Cuba had 600,000 people out in Havana.
Incredible. The photos are breathtaking.
Yeah, and this is the support of the Cuban Revolution, right? This is why, regardless of how heavy the burden of the blockade weighs on them, this is why the revolution still continues to this day, because it has this popular support. And I don't know exactly whether or not this story came out in a strategic way the day after this happened, but it does sort of make you think, right? And another thing about this article in CBC, which a complete regime change propaganda, I totally agree with you. But it waits till it gets to the very bottom of the article, and it says, it has like two quotes. It has like a quote from like some travel agency and from Air Canada, where both of them are saying, the tourism was a bit down in the first quarter, but it's actually starting to stabilize and go back up again. So like they're painting this as a huge crisis, and it's not even clear if you read the whole article itself that this is the crisis that they're trying to make it out to be.
Yeah. And the most that you'll see here, they quote a couple of experts, One of them is an economist who I believe is based in Havana. The other is a Cuba analyst. Whatever we're doing on this podcast, never call us Cuba analysts. Yeah. Anytime the CBC uses that language, you know that you're about to hear from a scoundrel. But they talk about the power failures. They talk about the hurricanes. They don't talk about the blockades. So they're trying to make it out as if an engineered, concerted series of attacks is akin to either a natural disaster or a failure of planning and maintenance by the Cuban people themselves. The pull quote is, "How do you provide an image of a carefree lifestyle, a quick, fun trip when you have that?" This is not a serious way to report on a blockade that has been denounced annually by the entire international community.
Yeah.
That is so meticulously well documented, and there's not a word of it in any of this coverage.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And I think that it's fair to say that CBC is the CBC's bad, but it's particularly out of step, I think, with Canadian general attitude towards Cuba. Historically, and that's demonstrated by the number of tourists that go from Canada to Cuba every year. People in Canada generally have a favorable view of Cuba, even if they're really anti-communist. But for some reason, the CBC over the past few years especially has been really ramping up their anti-Cuba coverage. And it's really infuriating to watch these pure propaganda pieces that could have been, written by the CAA coming out in the CBC. It's ridiculous.
As you say, it's also a fairly apolitical tourist who has this returning relationship to Cuba. It's not just people doing solidarity work brigades and engaging with the political history of the island and socialist construction and so on, though we would obviously encourage everyone to do so. There's a reason why Canada, as the CBC article notes, was the largest contributor to Cuban tourism. I think that for many years, there were more Canadian tourists through Cuba than any other country. And of course, there's still tourism from Russia, and we discussed the new influx of Chinese visitors, and that's wonderful. But it's in light of, and perhaps this is part of what I find so offensive about this, it's in light of this well-demonstrated historical interchange and friendship that these articles are being published. You know, they're trying to reverse course on what has been a very, very good, vibrant relationship. If you go to the Government of Canada's travel advisories on their website, the risk level that they assign Cuba is always being upgraded these days. They're telling everyone to exercise a high degree of caution, you know? And it varies a little, region by region, but they are talking about petty crime alongside power outages and so on. And the shortages that, again, we will never speak of this on this podcast or in our political work without immediately citing the blockade. The shortages are parlayed by the Government of Canada into this frightful narrative of, you know, an island of hustlers and delinquents encroaching tourists and so on. This is, on one hand, an intended effect of the blockade, and on the other hand, doesn't ring true to my experience. The Government of Canada is publishing a sort of fraudulent dystopian narrative under the guise of a travel advisory. So what are we to make of that?
And a few months ago, like fairly recently, the Secretary General of UN Tourism said, quote, "Cuba is one of the safest countries I have visited in the world," close quote. You know, Cuba has a long history with tourism. Obviously, before the revolution, it was a sort of playground of U.S. elites. It was a tourist sector that was basically controlled by the U.S. mob. And you know, so Cuba took on, expanding its tourism sector during the special period in the 90s very cautiously and in a very planned out way. You know, it's interesting, before the special period and the fall of the Soviet Union, they were less promoting international tourism to Cuba and more so promoting domestic tourism inside Cuba, so that people of Cuba could sort of get to know their country, get to know their island. But, you know, I found this quote from Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was sort of like a liberal political analyst or intellectual in the United States in the 20th century. And he describes his experience in Cuba before the revolution this way, quote, "I was enchanted by Havana and appalled by the way that the lovely city was being debased into a great casino and brothel for American businessmen over for a big weekend from Miami. My fellow countrymen reeled through the streets, picking up 14-year-old Cuban girls and tossing coins to make men scramble in the gutter. One wondered how any Cuban, on the basis of this evidence, could regard the United States with anything but hatred." Close quote. But this is essentially what, like, Trump administration and previous U.S. administrations are trying to turn Cuba back to. And so this history was very much in the minds of the Cuban government when they started to open up again to international tourism. And so, you know, you'll see, anti-Cuba commenters talk about how, Cubans weren't even allowed in the hotels that were built for international tourists for a few years. And it's for specific reasons. They were trying to shield Cuban people from this type of tourism that was happening before the revolution, right? And who's coming to Cuba on vacation? Just let me be clear. Hopefully everybody listening will go to Cuba on vacation.
Yes. Yeah.
But
book now.
Yes, book now. It's very important. But I think Cuba is much cheaper to travel to than a lot of other destinations. It's a lot safer than going to like the United States, for example. But it's still a sort of like a class level. People with certain means who go on vacations to places like Cuba, and so it's understandable that the Cuban government would want to try to maintain a divide between basically these bourgeois people who are very materialistic, very individualist, coming to Cuba and, sort of infecting this collective spirit of the Cuban people. That didn't really work. And now Cubans are able to go to these resorts, are able to go to these hotels, but there's other things that come along with this opening up to tourism that Cuba has really had to stay on top of. For example, it also means that Cuba had to legalize the US dollar. They had to be accepting US dollars, for one thing, so people would come and they could spend money, but also because, they need US dollars for international trade, right? And so this is one of their main means of getting US dollars for that exact purpose. But then that opens up other problems, right? They have like dollar only stores, right? And people who worked in the tourism sector had more access to the US dollar through tips and stuff like that than other Cubans would have. And this did cause a bit of like a crack in the egalitarianism. We still see how like remittances being sent from the US and from over the world, like back to Cuba. It's usually the white Cubans who have access to this. It's usually the white Cubans who are working in the tourism sector. So these sort of like colonial vestiges that Cuba has been so successful in fighting against, and has probably been more advanced than any other country in the world in fighting against these types of things. They can't completely overcome it because of the blockade, because of the necessity of them having to sort of invite capitalism in a limited sense into their country so that they can have tourism, so they can get US dollars. But it's such a complicated thing that the Cubans are dealing with. So I think that people, when they see stories like this in the CBC that just tries to flatten it out and just make it so stupid, it's really infuriating, and like it just leads to people having such a poor understanding of geopolitical issues, and specifically the issues between the United States and Cuba and the role that Canada plays in that relationship.
And it's tricky because they've gotten rid of the convertible currency, but you still have this informal dual currency system of necessity, and it produces not only a lot of internal stratification, but we've spoken about this as well. It does urge on participation in illicit economies that elude state control and contribute to this level of kind of simmering discontent. It's really interesting to see the kind of social means that these economic measures become at street level.
Yeah. And Cuba has been actively counteracting those negative effects of tourism as well by investing more in the people at the community level. This is also the time period where you got this model of healthcare that Cuba has now with the doctor and the nurse and the local office that's making sure that everybody in the community has direct access to the healthcare it needs, and really trying to support people so that they aren't so susceptible to the sort of flashy pairs of Nikes and Rolex watches that might come off the plane to Veradero or wherever the case may be. And again, that's why 600,000 people were out in Havana for May Day. So
yeah, it's really remarkable the breadth of participation in the present state of the revolution. Nobody has spoken as seriously of the present in Cuba than the Cuban government itself, than the Communist Party, than the people's organizations that are confronting it in the day-to-day. We just demand, and we ought to demand as solidarity movements in Canada, we just demand honesty about the extent to which this is a produced effect of the U.S. blockade, and the fact that our government is complicit in those straitened conditions and their reproduction. We don't need to deny that it's a difficult time. We need to constantly uplift and attest to the strength of the Cuban spirit, but also constantly request of our media that they correctly attribute the shortages and the difficulties, because right now they're not.
El día primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz: gracias, Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite: gracias, Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite: gracias, Fidel.